Putin knew that if you could go in and grab this stuff from the DNC, or his henchmen do, chances that the U.S. was going to retaliate?
Very low.
Somewhere between 0 and -5.
Venezuela's economy is in free fall. Grocery store shelves are empty and hospitals lack basic medicine. But have no fear, President Maduro's cryptocurrency is here. And speaking of technology buzzwords, have you heard of AI, artificial intelligence? They tell me it's kind of a big deal. Welcome to your GZERO world. I'm Ian Bremmer, here in the West Village of New York City. For your big interview this week, I talk politics and cybersecurity with New York Times national security correspondent David Sanger. And on puppet regime, Mark Zuckerberg aims to boost Facebook's ailing stock price with a brand new dating app. We'll swipe right just for you. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. Because of oil riches, Venezuela was once South America's richest country per capita. They are now in the midst of a 5-year economic crisis that's left many unable to buy basic food or medicine. The average Venezuelan last year lost 17 pounds of weight. The IMF warns that inflation in Venezuela this year could reach 1,000,000% by December. They'd expected 12,000% at the beginning of the year. That's an economic crisis comparable to Germany's after World War I and Zimbabwe's in the early 2000s. According to Gallup, only 17% of Venezuelans said they felt safe walking alone at night. Masses are fleeing conditions in Venezuela. As you might expect, over 1 million have recently arrived in neighboring Colombia. President Maduro himself continues to tighten his grip on power. He won a second 6-year term in May elections earlier this year. But opposition politicians and countries around the world say that the result was completely illegitimate. For Maduro's part, he alleges Venezuela is on the receiving end of an economic war being waged by the United States and Europe. But the only economic war being waged in Venezuela is by Maduro himself. His latest plan is to replace their national currency, the bolivar, with a new one that will be tied to the oil-backed petro cryptocurrency. That's a fantasy. And he's also going to strip 5 zeros from the currency's banknotes. That's not a fantasy. It'll look nice. It won't accomplish anything. Believe it or not, President Maduro originally won election free and fair. It was democratic. But the only way he stays in power now is more repression and more violence. This week, I sit down with Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times national security correspondent David Sanger. He's the author of The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. It's fast becoming the authoritative text on cybersecurity threats facing the world today. Let's get to it. David, great to be with you.
Great to be back with you.
Let me start with fear. Are we more fearful than we should be? I mean, why don't we start with some ground truths, things that people are concerned about that they don't really need to be?
The main import of hacks frequently is to create fear and doubt and confusion. And so when you think about why you're worried that someone may get inside your autonomous car, it's because one day you may pop in to go to the supermarket and discover it's driving you off a cliff, in which case you're unlikely to make use of your autonomous car. If you think when you go to the ballot box and pull the lever for your favorite candidate, and you actually think that maybe someone's gotten inside and your vote's gonna look like it's for the candidate you hate,
That's rigged, yeah.
you may not come out to vote. And over time, that erodes the institutions we've come to go trust. And that's why there are some things in the world that you don't basically want to go trust to an automated system. I mean, I don't understand what the problem is with having backup paper ballots.
Would you say that most of the concern is about fear as opposed to reality of the impact of the hacks from what we know so far?
Yeah, we don't have any evidence so far, looking at the 2016 election, that votes were changed because of what the Russians did. We have suspicions, and we have suspicions for lots of good reasons. I mean, if people looked at enough fake Facebook ads, there's some gullible portion of the population, or maybe not even very gullible, but people who thought they were just real ads, whose opinions might have been changed. But to know whether or not the hack was successful, you'd have to crawl between the ears of thousands, if not millions, of voters who were right on the edge between voting for Donald Trump and voting for Hillary Clinton, and figure out whether a Facebook ad actually made the difference. More worrisome out of that hack was the part that we don't think really worked terribly well, but may next time.
Which is?
Which was getting inside the voter registration systems. Now,
which they did try to do, apparently.
They did, and they succeeded at least in Arizona and Illinois, and we think in several other states.
Do we know this was the Russians in this case?
That was the Russians, and there's no question. It was a different group of Russians than the Russians who were doing Facebook. These people specialized, right? But it was, in fact, the Russians who went off and did that. Next time it may not be. Next time it could be somebody else.
We've heard for a long time, no one plays defense well on cyber.
Right.
Is at least there a mutually assured cyber destruction?
There is not.
Because?
You've gotten to one of the big differences between cyber and nuclear weapons. And one of the arguments of the perfect weapon is that the reason it's a perfect weapon is that you, unlike nuclear weapons, you can dial it up and you can dial it down. You can hide where the attack comes from. These are all incredibly valuable things to be able to go do. So the concept of mutually assured destruction comes from a nuclear age where if the Soviets threw missiles at our cities, we throw them at their cities, and no one's going to start off because we know the end of this is going to be total wreckage. Cyber's the opposite. Because you can dial it up and dial it down, you can calibrate a cyber attack to be pretty sure that the government or corporation that's on the receiving end of it is not going to mount a significant retaliation. And basically the history of cyber in the past 5 or 10 years is one of attacks that do not get responded to. A good place to look at the question of why presidents are concerned about authorizing counter-cyber attacks would be the attack on Sony a few years ago.
By the North Koreans.
By the North Koreans, and the attack by the Russians on the election system. Both of those happened under the Obama administration. So let's take them one at a time.
Okay.
The Sony hack, you may remember, was to try to prevent Sony from releasing a really bad movie that I can save you 2 hours of your life by suggesting that you don't download. It's called The Interview.
The Interview.
The Interview.
Seth Rogen. Do not watch that film.
Okay.
Okay, David Sanger, 2 thumbs down.
2 thumbs down.
Fair enough.
Although I have to tell you, my book editor loved the movie and constantly tried to edit out my critiques of the movie.
Actually happened?
The book. I wouldn't let him do it.
Okay.
You know, I said I got to draw the line of journalistic integrity here. So
that's good.
Okay. So in that case, the North Koreans did the only logical thing you do when you try to stop a movie, which is they wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations demanding that he stop the movie from coming out. We all know what influence the Secretary General.
This was Ban Ki-moon at the time.
Yeah.
Who, even among Secretaries General, would have been one of the weaker ones to send it to.
Not only that, his influence in Hollywood was probably somewhat limited.
I would say so.
Yeah. So anyway, that didn't work, it turned out. So in the fall of 2014, they put malware inside the Sony computer systems, and they were enormously patient. They spent months mapping out just how the Sony systems worked. And when they decided to strike, which was right around Thanksgiving of 2014, so a few months later.
Before the movie had come out.
The movie was supposed to be released at Christmas. They not only released some emails that they had stolen out of the system, which revealed vital secrets, like the fact that Angelina Jolie, some people thought was difficult to work with on the set. You know, this just in, right? But they melted down 70% of Sony's computing systems. All of a sudden, there were all these meetings in the White House. First of all, did we see this coming? No one saw it coming. Why? Because most of the targets in the United States are in private networks. The United States doesn't monitor private networks. If it did, we'd all be shrieking about the privacy invasion. Second, is this an act of war? Well, come on, guys, we're talking about a Seth Rogen movie here, okay? This isn't necessarily an act of war. In fact,
it's an American corporation. It's worth a lot of money.
It's an American corporation with a Japanese parent. And by the way, when I went to Japan and I asked everybody, so what'd you guys do in holding your meetings about this attack? They said, we never even had any meetings about this attack, okay? So it's an American corporation. President Obama said at one point it was an act of cyber vandalism. Well, you don't call in the US government to go retaliate for acts of vandalism. You call a local police and ask them to, like, round up the teenagers, right?
Yep.
So they couldn't even sort of decide what it was. In the end, because there had been a threat to go attack moviegoers, probably an empty threat, President Obama issued some fairly weak economic sanctions against the North Koreans that I bet the North Koreans never even noticed in the flood of other economic sanctions we've had against North Korea. For a day or two or three, the internet slowed to a dead crawl in North Korea.
Yeah.
Thus really pissing off the 10 people authorized to use the internet in North Korea. We think the Chinese probably did that. We didn't want to go into their systems in North Korea because to do it, we'd have to go through networks
Chinese
in China.
drivers, yeah.
And somebody said, so how do you go explain this to the Chinese? So that was example one. Example two was a Russia hack.
And the lesson from example one is we have no idea how to respond to this stuff.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay? And the example from lesson two is 2 years later, we still have no idea how to go respond to this stuff. So the Russians didn't start with the Democratic National Committee. The Russians started with attacks on the White House unclassified email system, the State Department unclassified email system, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In each one, we eventually detected they were there. In the case of the White House, as I report in the book, the NSA got into a 2-week-long battle with the Russians to try to oust them, basically exorcise them from the system. The Russians kept coming back in, not because they were getting anything that great, but because they wanted to show that they could, to make us just uneasy enough about the security of our systems to say, you guys can block off this path and we'll tunnel in over here. All of these happened prior to the DNC hack. Did the United States come out and name Russia as the aggressor? Never. Did it punish the Russians? No. Why not? Well, it's espionage. They're coming in, we go in, it's like what people do, shame on us for keeping our systems unsupported. If you're Vladimir Putin and you're looking at this record, what do you think? You think, well, they're not actually willing to make a big deal about the fact that I got into the White House system? So who's going to care about the DNC, which is basically staffed by a bunch of college kids? So Putin knew that if you could go in and grab this stuff from the DNC, or his henchmen knew, chances that the U.S. was going to retaliate?
Very low.
Somewhere between 0 and -5.
So this all sounds pretty bad.
That's because it's pretty bad.
But the part of the story that I need to ask you is there another half of this that is about Americans engaging in offensive cyber efforts against countries that we don't like? I mean, we are the world's largest economy. We're the most technologically sophisticated. We spend as much on our military as the next 7 countries combined. If I were going to guess, I would guess that the Americans have pretty significant cyber capabilities, at least offensively. Do you have any reason to believe, either yes or no, I mean, either way, that the Americans aren't doing the kind of things externally that the Chinese, for example, are doing to the Americans? Not in response to what the Chinese are doing, but just as a matter of practice.
So you've been reading what I write for many a year,
Yeah,
and
sure.
a lot of what I write is about American offensive operations. The biggest, meanest, and most famous of which was codenamed Olympic Games. And that was the American and Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear production facilities.
The Olympic Games attack, what year was that?
Well, it started in about 2007 and 2008. The code escaped and became visible to the world in the summer of 2010. It was, if there's anything that's sort of the original sin of this whole era, and in fact, that part of the book is called Original Sins, it's the Olympic Games hack. So let's remind you what this was about. People were afraid that if the Iranians surged ahead with their nuclear program, the Israelis would end up bombing it, which they came very close to doing. That we had to head that off, because if the Israelis got into a war with Iran, it was only going to be days before we were sucked into it too. So President Bush, who had refused to give the Israelis bunker-busting bombs and so forth, helped wrap them into the Olympic Games program, something Israelis had been working on themselves. It was a fascinating case because it was the first really sophisticated hack where we did, through computer operations, something that previously we would have only been able to do by bombing or sending in saboteurs. So in a hillside in Tennessee, they built a replica of the Natanz nuclear enrichment site.
The Iranian site.
The Iranian site. They stole a bunch of it, they borrowed a bunch of nuclear centrifuges. These are the machines that spin at supersonic speeds that we had gotten from Libya when we cleaned out the Libyan nuclear program.
What the Iranians would be using to enrich uranium.
Very similar stuff. They used this model to build an enrichment center and attack it with code. They speed up the centrifuges and slow them down, destabilize them, make them explode. They pack up the remnants of this stuff, put it on an airplane, fly it into Washington, drive it into the northwest gate of the White House, dump it out on the Situation Room conference table, invite President Bush down to take a look at the shards. He utters an extremely vivid term, and they're off and running to do the program. President Obama then inherited the program, expanded it, and then we all know what happened. The code got out. That turned a lot of journalists, myself included, on to what happened, and I ended up telling the story in a previous book of the decision-making there. President Obama was concerned that once the United States got down the road of doing offensive cyber, every other state would turn around and use that as an excuse for their own offensive cyber operations. And guess what? He turned out to be right. At the time I wrote that book 6 years ago, I couldn't find another sophisticated state-on-state attack. Not criminal, not, right, but really sophisticated use of a state, use of cyber by a state for political purposes. When I was working on The Perfect Weapon, we stopped counting at about 250 state-on-state attacks, all within the past 5 or 6 years.
A few ideas from you on both a regulatory response from government, if you think one is possible, as well as kind of what the average person can do, how they should think about these things differently, given the mistakes that are being made.
Well, let's start with what you could do. I mean, some of them are simple. If you don't use two-factor authentication, that part where the bank sends a code to your cell phone before you pull money out and stuff like that, start doing that. It's not a 100% solution. If you're doing it in a state where the state owns the telephone company, they're going to be able to intercept those numbers as well. But it's a start. There are a bunch of sort of good hygiene things, the sort of safe sex program for cyber that you can go do that will cut down on a lot of random stuff.
I don't believe we're going to have this talk right now, but okay.
We're going to try not to, because I don't want to shock you too much, okay? But know that that will help you against criminals, vandals, teenagers, drive-by hackers. If you're really the target of the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians and the North Koreans, none of that's going to work. But you need to do it for the same reason you need to put locks on your house and buy some insurance for your stuff, because there's a basic group of things that you got to do for yourself and you can't expect the government to do. Now, you don't expect by putting locks in your house and buying insurance that you're protecting against incoming missile attacks. And you're saying, thank you, I'm leaving that one to the US military. And that raises the question, what does the government got to do? At what point do they have to step in? And that is a completely unresolved issue within the United States government, and makes it all the more amazing that a few months ago, when John Bolton came in as the National Security Advisor,
he said to get rid of that guy that was running cyber.
not only the guy who was running cyber, he got rid of the whole cyber coordinator office that was supposed to go sort out all of these different issues in the White House.
Yeah. Why did he do that?
I can't get a coherent answer out of them. The closest they've come is to say cyber is part of everything. Of course, you and I know something that is part of everything, no one's in charge, right? The effort over the past 10 years has been, let's put some people in charge because this is really hard. Not only that, if you go into the intelligence community's assessment to Congress about what are the biggest threats to the United States, 2007, it was terrorism. And you read the 2007 report, you can't find the word cyber. But for the past 4 or 5 years, it's been cyber is the #1 threat, ahead of nuclear proliferation, ahead of Al-Qaeda, ahead of ISIS, any form of terrorism, it's cyber. Great time, really great time to dismantle the White House coordinator job. So my first fear is the US government is actually less organized on this than we were 18 months ago. My second fear is that while our private cyber defenses have gotten better, we're all beginning to use that two-factor authentication. We know what spear phishing emails look like. We're going to be more careful. While we've gotten more careful, more things have gotten connected to the internet faster than we've come up the scale in protecting ourselves. So I'll give you some examples. People buy these little video cameras that you put around your house to give you some video surveillance. You can watch it on your iPhone, make sure your house is safe. They're cheap, they're made in China, $50 a piece. They come with a built-in password called password or something similarly safe. They're almost impossible to reprogram the password. We've already seen one attack where somebody went in and massed together the computing power of hundreds of thousands of these video cameras and used it to attack a company in the United States. And it's basically using them as a bot. But we are connecting more and more and more things to the internet. If you walked into your house 10 years ago, you probably had, you know, maybe your phone, certainly a couple of computers connected to the internet. Today, you walk into your house, your thermostat, maybe that refrigerator, certainly the car,
and the average
certainly the
person's
Alexa.
not going to be able to do anything to respond to that.
No, and you're not going to go in and reprogram every password. You can't even remember all the passwords you have now. So one thing we could do of a regulatory effect is a minimum level of safety for any product that's going to be connected to the internet. And manufacturers will scream, but you know what? Car manufacturers didn't like it when we said you had to put in seatbelts.
I knew you were going to use a seatbelt example.
Right?
You're of that age.
Of that age.
Yes.
And then they didn't like it when you're going to do airbags. They didn't actually bitch that much about putting in the rear view camera, but starting in a few months, every new car is going to have a rear view camera.
Connected to the internet.
Connected to the internet. So why not say, here are some minimum safety standards before you can connect up to the internet?
David Sanger.
Great to see you.
Thank you very much.
And on puppet regime this week, Mark Zuckerberg tries to jumpstart Facebook's flagging stock price with a brand new dating app.
Ian here, and this week we have a sneak peek at the beta testing for Facebook's new dating app. Over to you, Mark.
Oh, hi. I was just sifting through your personal data, but as you know, now I'm using that data to launch a dating app called
Down to Zuck.
To show you how this works, let's start with a tough one. Supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Well, let's see here. We both have strong opinions about Iran. We both disagree with Trump about Syria. Whoa, we both bought same facial hair comb on Amazon. My match is, what? John Bolton?
Oh, I'm down to Zuck with you, you mother...
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week with Toria Newland, CEO of the Center for New American Security, an expert on all things Europe. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, check us out at gzeromedia.com.